Let me set the scene. It's 1968. Martin Luther King is assassinated. There are riots in cities across the United States and protests. I'm in Europe studying on my junior year abroad in Scotland, and the fascination is with Czechoslovakia, a small country behind the Iron Curtain that's experimenting with democratic socialism, they called it. They were starting to have a free press and starting to have a new constitution, starting to open up. And the press was fascinated, I was fascinated, and I wanted to spend time there, but I didn't have a lot of money. So I approached the American Foreign Service Committee, the Quakers, to put me in a work camp in Slovakia for several weeks in the summer. But as I was headed there, the headlines in the Herald Tribune had pictures and headlines of riots at the Chicago Democratic Convention and tanks maneuvering on maneuvers around Czechoslovakia. So I called the leader of the work camp and said, is it safe to come? And he said, of course it is. Well, it turned out that there wasn't information inside the country about what was going on with the maneuvers outside the country. I went, everything was fine. I was in Slovakia for 3 weeks, and then a small group of us headed to Prague to be tourists, stay in student dorms outside of the city, overlooking the city, before we went back to our various places. There was a French guy, 2 Dutch girls, an English guy, and myself. And so the morning of August 21st, 7 o'clock in the morning, there was a knock on my door. Dominique, the French guy, had been in the park below and said he saw Russian tanks, that we had to get up and do something. So what I did was I found a payphone and I called the American embassy to basically say I was there and ask what I should do. And they said it would be safe for foreigners to leave the country. It didn't seem very safe to me at the moment. But the group of 5 of us got together to talk about what we should do. And I thought that we should go to a store that was pretty near the dorms and get supplies. And we had an argument among ourselves because several people thought we should just get things for breakfast and lunch, and I thought we should get things for a week. We headed to the store and there was already a line, and it became pretty clear that we needed to buy things for a while. The people in the line were looking at newspapers, and the headline said, "We didn't ask for help." It was a locally controlled Czech paper saying that the Russians did not come because there was any request in Czechoslovakia. The Russians were saying that they were asked to help. We went into the store, and already there were empty shelves. So we kind of grabbed what we could. I remember we got at least 1 loaf of very dark bread. We got lots of canned goods, and some of the things we couldn't tell what they were because it was in Czech. Sometimes there would be pictures, sometimes not, but we got supplies and went back, put it in a kitchen in the dorm, and then tried to decide what to do. A couple of the kids, we were kids, decided that they wanted to go into town to see what was happening. I decided that I really didn't know what was happening, and that information was pretty important in a scenario when you don't know what's really going on. So I decided to keep a journal and to take down what I learned and from whom. So the BBC, we were able to listen to on radios. Voice of America, we were able to listen to on radios and in English, so I could understand that. There were students speaking all kinds of languages. There were some Cuban students. I could understand Spanish. So I got a lot of information about what was happening. And at one point during the day, actually, tanks came up into the courtyard of the dorm because the soldiers were staying at a base that they had taken over that was nearby. A couple of my friends decided that they wanted to go into town, and they came back and reported that they saw tanks, some tanks on fire, Molotov cocktails had been thrown, lots of peaceful demonstrations, but they were going down a road and a street, and a tank came down the street firing. A door opened and they were pulled into an apartment. It's interesting because I read a story during the recent demonstrations that demonstrators had been pulled into houses. So it seems to be kind of a human response. They came back and reported. I was very glad that I wasn't among the brave ones to have that experience and just be able to write it down. So we gathered, all of us, and I think we added some other students for dinner. We did have goulash. I don't know if we could tell what it was called from the label, or we were just lucky. And I think we also had some wine. And they gathered in my room. It was a modern dorm with a very big picture window, and we could look down into the city. And at one point, tracer bullets came above the dorm, and we dove to the floor because we didn't know if shots were going to follow, if the windows were going to be broken. We had no idea what was happening in town, if there were demonstrations, if people were being killed, shot, whatever. But it ended. There weren't shots to fire, and we all went to bed. I know no one slept very well. But the next morning when we woke up, the English guy and I were supposed to take a train together, and he got word that there was a train leaving, and he thought we should go try to catch the train. And he had actually checked with the student travel office, and they said that the train was going, and they would, we had vouchers, and they would give us tickets. So he grabbed my suitcase, put it on his head. I was carrying things. We ran down through a park. We ended up hitching rides. People were very helpful. We went to the ticket office. We got the tickets. We went to the train station. The train had already left. And they told us there'd be a train the next day, but we didn't know whether to believe them or not. And at that point, I decided I wanted to go to the American embassy. And my English friend wanted to go to the British embassy. And they were both near each other. So we walked from the train station, but we had to go over a bridge. And the bridge had Russian soldiers and tanks. So as we walked across the bridge, the soldiers at gunpoint asked us to, in Russian, but we understood what they were talking about. They wanted us to search our suitcases. And I was afraid they were going to take things. I had things that I had bought in Czechoslovakia. I wanted to take them home. They just searched and closed up our cases, and we went on. And the American embassy was a very big house. It used to be a banker's house. It was, you know, big steps and very solid, big, thick carpeting in the floor, nice fruit in bowls, you know, the way an embassy would be, and quiet. I remember that it was basically quiet. There were people there, the staff was there, and there were other people kind of gathering, but it wasn't a big crowd. And I could hear the staff on walkie-talkies talking to Vienna, trying to arrange for buses to come to pick people up from Czechoslovakia, from Prague. But I would have, the pickup places were not the embassy. I would have had to have gone over that bridge again with the Russian soldiers and to a hotel, which I didn't really want to do. So, and then the other thing was that they were trying to arrange another convoy of cars to go. There had been one in the morning. And actually Shirley Temple Black was in that convoy, and she came back to the Czechoslovakia later as US ambassador. Fortunately, someone came in the embassy. He was a professor at Fordham. He had been in Prague on a Fulbright fellowship for a couple of years. He was coming to find out about the car convoys, but he decided he was going to drive to the border himself, but he offered to take someone with him. He had a car, and he had things that he had bought that year, art, he had books, and so I asked questions faster than anybody else. He spoke Russian and Czech and German. I thought that was a real advantage in this situation. I didn't. And so I volunteered faster than anybody else. And we went to his apartment. He picked up the rest of his stuff, and we headed to the border. The first thing was, there were lots of people actually standing on the sides of the road, and we had an American flag that we had put on the windshield. So people were waving. And they stopped us and said that the border that we were headed for had been closed and that we needed to go somewhere else. We also needed to get gas. So we stopped at a gas station. Again, you didn't know if the stations were going to be open or what was going to happen. We filled the tank and headed off to this border that we didn't know was going to be open or not. And it's getting later in the day. So it felt actually like I was in the movie Torn Curtain, which had been done in the early 60s, of escaping from a behind the Iron Curtain country. It really did feel like that. So at one point there was a barricade of tanks across the road, Russian tanks. And so we stopped, obviously, we had to, and they wanted to see our passports. Paul Trensky, the professor, handed his passport, which was an American, but it said he had been born in Prague, in Czechoslovakia, and they couldn't understand how he could be an American but be born in Czechoslovakia. So he asked to talk to the supervisor, probably a general, and the general bought his story, fortunately. My passport was fine and I was okay to go. But afterwards, I really thought about that. I was totally dependent on him. And he was speaking Russian. If they hadn't believed his story, I would have been in jail too, and not able to communicate. Fortunately, that didn't happen. So we continued towards the border. There was a line of cars we could see, so it seemed the border was open. We had to wait, that was okay. And he had a bottle of Chivas Regal. And we opened the bottle. We each had a glass, probably a little glass because you can't drink very much whiskey. And we made it through the border. The border guards were there, and they actually exchanged our money. We got to the other side, and we're in Germany. There's a town, but there are lights, street lights, and lights in restaurants, etc. The Czech side of the border was dark. That was one of the things about Eastern Europe. There wasn't a lot of electricity and lots of lights. At any rate, we headed to a hotel. At this point, I really wanted to call my parents. This is 1968. It's not, I'd been gone almost a year. I had called my parents only once at Christmas time. And but I wanted to let them know that I was out, and so they didn't have to worry anymore. So, but in '68, you had to request a long distance call like that. It's called a trunk call. So the hotel put in the request. Several hours later, I was notified that the call was going to go through, and nobody answered. So I had to wait till the next day, again, go through this, requesting a call. I finally get my parents on the phone, and I say, I'm out. My mother says, we thought you had left before this happened. We thought you left several days ago. If we had known, we could have worried. So they didn't have to worry. I made it back. I learned a lot from the experience, and it still is with me. I became a journalist in radio and television, ABC, CBS, and CNN. I continued to write things as the experience showed me. Also, a professor in college sent my firsthand account to a couple of university archives, which was a really important piece of being taken seriously. The other part is, kind of more internal. As we started into this pandemic, I remembered those empty store shelves, and early on, we were in grocery stores preparing for filling up the pantry for a month, not hoarding, but filling up the pantry. Czechoslovakia was another 20 years before the fall of the Berlin Wall, and then ultimately a democracy forming and the government falling in Czechoslovakia, then became the Czech Republic and Slovakia. So it took a very long time, ultimately, for the change to happen. And, back to '68, it's 50 years later, more than 50, 52. And we're seeing some of the same things as we saw in 1968. But I think it's also an example of how it takes time for change to happen. But this time, it does seem like change is happening.